Next, we will discuss conflict theory. So, conflict theory's whole premise is that society is built on differences in power. Some groups have power in our society, other groups do not. And when we're talking about power in sociology, we're not necessarily talking about brute strength or physicality. Power refers to the ability of an individual or a group of individuals to get what they want despite resistance from others. Okay? So, at the basis of conflict theory is that everyone in our society wants power. Everyone in society wants the ability to get what they want, to have it their way, to be able to build social structures and establish the means and the norms of society so that they are at an advantage, right? Everyone wants to be at the top of the pyramid, but of course, not everyone can. We need people to be in power positions, and we need people to be subservient. People with power are in control of what we call scarce resources, which are essentially just valuable, coveted aspects of society. So scarce resources could be things like money, it could be prestige in terms of your job or your status in society. Another scarce resource could be access to education, access to a healthy living environment, right? So people are in control of these scarce resources. There's a finite amount of them, right? There's a finite amount of income and money in our world, and people are competing over those things. And the people who have the most scarce resources have the most power in our society. And when people have power in our society, they construct it in ways that enable them to maintain their power. So think about this. If you have power, right, if you have some privilege in society, you have special access to scarce resources that other people don't have. For example, if you have a lot of money in our society, are you likely going to just give out all of the excess money that you have to other individuals to level the playing field? Or are you going to try and keep accruing more and more wealth? Well, in our society, which is quite greedy, a conflict theorist would argue, people with power are going to try and maintain their power by building structures in our society that make it very difficult for the people below them to surpass them, right? If you get promoted to being CEO of a company, are you going to try and help the people below you dethrone you so they can become the CEO and you can get demoted? Of course not, right? So that's what this image on the left here represents, right? This is a classic game of tug of war. But now, what we see here is that there's this one little red dude on the left up against these four other little red dudes on the right, but the little red dude on the left is holding his own. Now, this doesn't really make sense to us logically because we would expect 4 against 1, the 4 people would have more power and pull this little red guy into a pool full of mud. But we're seeing that's not happening here, and that's because power is unequally distributed amongst people in our society. So in this instance, this little red dude might have a very powerful position in society. He might occupy several privileged identities that give him access to more scarce resources than these 4 people on the right combined. So for example, in our society, white people are in a position of power over people of color. And this has a lot to do with the historical development of the United States. You know, our country was built on racism. Our country was built on the enslavement of African Americans and treating African Americans as property, the genocide of Native Americans, placing Asian Americans in internment camps, deporting Latinx Americans now in our country, you know, xenophobia and the xenophobic attitudes towards Muslims, you know. So in our society, if you are a white person, you have privilege and you have power because our society is built on the disadvantaging of people of color. Also gender, right? If this little red dude on the right side happens to be a man and these 4 people on the right happen to be women, men have a lot more power in our society, and this also has to do with the historical development of the United States. Many people don't realize that women, similar to people of color, were treated as property for the first several hundred years that the United States was developed, you know. Until fairly recently, a woman could be raped by her husband and it would not be considered illegal. That wasn't even a crime for a man to rape his wife. Women very recently could not own property independently. A woman could not get a line of credit without her husband co-signing. A woman couldn't own land or own a home on her own without her husband's approval. And until 100 years ago, women didn't gain the right to vote in the U.S., specifically white women. For women of color, it took even longer for them to gain the right to vote. So again, having power or privilege of being a man can give you access to more scarce resources in comparison to women. Socioeconomic status is another big contribution to power imbalances in our society. People with access to higher education are more likely to get higher paying jobs. And again, the more money you have in society, the more power you have, the more privileges you have. So if you think back to the first week of class, we talked about, marginalization and oppression, how certain groups in society are privileged over other groups in society which are disadvantaged. And that is very much a founding idea within this theory of conflict theory. Society is built on these unequal distributions of scarce resources across groups. Groups that have power try to build society in ways that enable them to maintain power, and people without power are constantly fighting or struggling, trying to climb up the social ladder, socioeconomic status, but it's very difficult because people with power do not want to make it easy. They do not want to give up their position of power in society. So applying conflict theory to gender, well, conflict theorists would suggest that people with power are able to create or socially construct the structures within their society. So since people with power want to maintain their power, they often construct structures that serve this purpose. The differences in power that are maintained by social structures result in systems of inequality. And we see this, one clear example, when we look at the workforce, right? Think about this. How does the structure of gender enable men to stay in power in the workforce? How does the social structure of gender enable men to stay in power in the workforce? Men in virtually every sector of the workforce in the US today are at an advantage in comparison to women. Men use their power to maintain positions of power in the paid workforce, making it difficult for women to access similar levels of power. One clear example of this is if we look at the distribution of earnings across gender for virtually every single job that exists in the workforce in the United States. So take a minute and take a look at this chart on the left here, okay? This shows women's earnings by occupation in comparison to men's. So these are the median earnings. The median is, again, remember back to last week, a measure of central tendency. So this is an average earnings for women in 12, over the course of the past year, looking at many different occupations here. All right, so the occupations are organized into three groups. You can see this top group here. These are occupations with 80% or more female workers. So these are occupations in the US that are predominantly occupied by women. This middle tier here are occupations with about 50% women, so a 50-50 split between men and women in these positions. And then this bottom bracket here are occupations where 80% of them are male workers, okay? Now these dark purple dots represent the medium earnings, so the average earnings for women in the position, and the light purple dots represent the average earnings for men in each position, all right? So take a look at this graph. If you'd like to pause the video for a minute, you sure can. And what observation are you making here? If I asked you to explain the findings presented in this graph in one sentence, what would you tell me? So hopefully you took a minute to look at this graph. I asked you if you could summarize this graph in one sentence, what would you tell me? And a clear finding from this is that regardless of occupation and regardless of the percentage of men or women in that occupation, men get paid more than women in virtually every occupation in the US, right? Look at this. On average, the median salary for men in the US looks to be just above $50,000, but for women, it appears to be somewhere around possibly $35,000 to $40,000, right? So a $10,000 to $15,000 difference on average for income for men and women. And what's surprising here is that even in jobs where women typically occupy the majority of positions, men still make more, right? Look at this first one here. For registered nurses, right? Even though women occupy 80% or more of the registered nurse positions in the US, a male registered nurse appears to get paid approximately $70,000 a year, while a female registered nurse only gets paid about $60,000 to $65,000 a year, right? And that same story holds true for every single occupation on here. Look at the big gap here in financial managers, right? Male financial managers on average getting paid over $100,000 a year in comparison to women who are getting paid only about $55,000 to $60,000 a year. And it's the same story each case. Now, conflict theory would explain this because For centuries, women were not allowed in the paid workforce. The paid workforce was exclusively occupied by men. So men socially constructed the workforce of the United States. So when women gained access to the paid workforce, they were at a structural disadvantage because they were entering a man's domain. And what we see still today is that even though it's obviously legal for women to work in all of these occupations now, they still experience that structural disadvantage because men created the workforce in ways that enable them to maintain their power. It's very difficult for women to exceed the same level of prestige and power in the paid workforce because men designed it that way to keep them at a disadvantage. Now, the structural disadvantaging of women in the workforce has contributed to what we call the gender wage gap. Still today, women only make about 83 cents to the man's dollar in the United States, and that gets even worse for women of color. And we'll talk more about that in a few weeks when we go into more detail about gender specifically. So, just like Durkheim was kind of the founding father, so to speak, of structural functionalism, Karl Marx is often referred to as the founding father of conflict theory. According to Marx, he saw society as being made up of individuals in different classes who compete for what he called capital. And he defined capital as social, material, and political resources such as food, housing, employment, education, and leisure time that people were in constant competition over. So whoever had more capital, according to Marx, had more power in society. So the more capital you had, the more scarce resources you had, the more ability you had to design society in ways that enabled you to protect keeping those resources and keeping your position of power. Marx suggested that social institutions like government, education, and religion all reflect this competition and their inherent inequalities and help maintain the unequal social structure in our United States. Like I said, men, for example, if we're looking at the social structure of gender, had power in government because, again, for centuries, women were excluded from government, right? Women weren't allowed to be elected into office. So men were able to decide the laws of our society, how our society was going to be structured politically. Those were all decisions that men made. And a clear example, we still see this today by looking at our government. Women only occupy about 25% of the seats in Congress in the United States. And there's a reason why we have never, in the 400 plus years of our country's being, we have never elected a woman president in the United States today. It's again because men have power in government. And they have that power, and they've maintained that power since the origination of the United States because they had access to capital. They had access to the resources to design that social structure. To boil things down, Marx explained conflict as the struggle between two groups or two classes of people in our society. He basically said everyone could be classified as either bourgeoisie or proletariat. So the bourgeoisie were the owners of the means of the production, people that had access to capital, the people that had all the power in the society. And the proletariat was the working class. So these were the people that were being exploited or taken advantage of the bourgeoisie. The proletariats outnumbered the bourgeoisie. There were more proletariats, more working class people than there were the owners of the means of production. But just because there was more of them does not mean that they had more power. Proletariat people were lacking power, which was really bizarre to Marx because Marx was like, hey, there's more proletariat people than there are bourgeoisie. If all the proletariats just revolted, let's start a revolution. Let's reconstruct this power structure in the US by protesting, by activism, by revolution. We could change these unequal distributions of wealth and resources in our society. So Marx was really an advocate for revolution and social change. Unlike functionalism, which was all about just maintaining stability, Marx and conflict theory were all about advocating for revolution to try and create a more equal society. So conflict theory, very big on social change. Like I said, society is constantly in conflict over resources according to a conflict theorist perspective. And in order to improve the access of resources for everyone and have more equality, we need to have more conflict in terms of advocating for social change. We shouldn't just accept society for what it is. We should advocate for social reform to increase access to these resources for everyone. And great examples of this advocating for social change would be the civil rights movement, the Me Too movement, more currently the Black Lives Matter movement. All of these are advocating for equality, to have equal distribution of resources for all groups in society, not just the elite few. Conflict theory is so focused on social change that it often neglects stability of society as a common critique, as is the reality that a lot of social change happens incrementally, very slowly,